All right. Thank you for joining me, Doovid. Thanks so much. Chuck Moskowitz here. Doovid, you've been a regular on the show. You're a Talmudic researcher, and you've traveled within Orthodox Jewish circles for many years. You've got a lot of insight, and recently you were invited on with Adam Green, No More News, to debate Jewish issues and Israel issues, or as they call it, Zionist issues. And Green had you in the middle of the screen, and on one side was himself, and the other side was this guy, John Christopher Bajorknis. Now, they're both anti-Zionist, as they call it, and I would argue anti-Jewish. But in the case of Adam Green, I think that he's well-meaning. I think his heart's in the right place, and that he is trying to understand the forces of the world that are causing wars and division. And for whatever reason, he has decided to blame the Jews. I think that he was influenced by a book called The Controversy of Zion, which was written in the 1950s, authored by Douglas Reed, which is filled with all kinds of inaccuracies. He blames the Jews for everything under the sun. On the other side was Bajorknis, who I view as somewhat of a malevolent character. I don't think he is well-intended. I think that he's filled with hate, and he's obsessed with Jews. And that comes across in not only his books and in his videos, but in his entire demeanor. I thought you handled yourself very well. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the particulars that were brought up in that interview, because, Judaism and Zionism, if you will, or Israel, these are certainly institutions and ideas that are subject to legitimate criticism. In the case of Green, I think it is more legitimate. The case of Bajorknis, it's with ill intent. But either way, could you please talk a little bit about your thoughts on that interview and some brief observations?
Yeah, just a lead up. I was on Jean-Francois Garepi, and I had debated him on consciousness, purely the question of whether consciousness arises from the soul or from the material brain, related to the Science of Consciousness conference in Switzerland this last week. If you heard of Stuart Hameroff, in fact, if you could get Stuart Hameroff as a guest,
I'd love to.
And obviously Jean-Francois Garepi is an interesting character, and Judaism didn't even really come up. One person super chatted something about Egypt, but I guess they're in the same circles. So Adam Green had messaged Jean-Francois, could you reach out to Doovid? And so I reached out to Adam, and he invited me on the stream, and he said, can he invite his friend Christopher Van Bjorknes? And I recognized the name, and I'd actually purchased his book on premonitions of the Holocaust, that I'd just seen from an Amazon recommendation. And it was actually pretty interesting. It's largely a compilation of editorials in the London Times from the early 1919, 1920 and different things. And you mentioned Bjorknes. He sent me an ebook. He had written a 3,000-page book trying to debunk Einstein. So certainly within the dissident questioning the role of Jews in society, he is one of the bigger scholars. He hit me with pages and numbers of many different quotes. And when I spoke to Adam, it seemed to me more like the role of Chabad and what people's belief in the Rebbe or an understanding of Hasidic Judaism. And then Christopher was more hitting me with very difficult questions about Judaism. He also said, Doovid's a man who reads the Talmud. He knows things that most Jews don't, like all the statements he questioned. Do you believe that Jews have a different soul than non-Jews? Do you believe that eventually non-Jews will be slaves to Jews? And then he's hitting me with the exact quotations from our religion. So in an interesting aspect, Bjorknes is like a Talmud Chacham. He read a 3,000-page book of collections. That's why I told Adam that he's selectively looking at the negative thing. I don't mind what he's saying, and I agree with a lot of his sentiment. I think it's a bad thing for the Jewish community to, I wouldn't use the word subvert, but to try to pressure American culture to do what's in the best interest of the Jews, even though it's probably not in the best interest of larger American society. And that could be extremely dangerous. And unfortunately, AIPAC, ADL, all types of Jewish organizations very commonly will possibly twist the truth in a way to make it look like you're not just like we as the Jewish people are asking you to do us a favor, but try to say like it's actually in your best interest, and the reason you're doing it has nothing to do with the Jewish people or Israel. It's because it's in your own self-interest. And I'm sure you've had countless amounts of those debates, but I say Bjerknes is actually quite a scholar, and he was able to quote the Jewish sources better than most rabbis. I wouldn't doubt if even my local Orthodox rabbis don't don't know the Talmud as well as Bjerknes. So in that way, I don't really believe in malevolent actors in that sense. I think there's competitive group interest in a way similar to Kevin McDonald, the culture of critique, where there's a different group interest between the possibly Israel and European nations or America or different forces, American Jews. If you followed what happened in Israel, I wouldn't go as far to say we're on the brink of an internal Jewish civil war, and that's coming out in American society with all the protest against immigration and deportation. And so I think I don't mind even Bjerknes. I don't mind his voice in saying society is being pushed in a certain direction that is bad for what he would consider his people, and largely the people pushing that are Jewish people and Jewish organizations. So from that respect, I didn't even mind Bjerknes, and he was pretty hostile. I got to admit that they came at me pretty hard, and I did a stream on my channel afterwards, like 8 hours. I called it Ask the Rabbi, and everyone who came on the stream was extremely hostile. So if you're taking the pulse of anti-Semitism, even that guy Handsome Truth, if you heard of him, who's kind of the Goyim Defense League, came on my stream, and he came at me with straight like 12th century blood libel accusations, and circumcision and mitzitza bal peh, and I had this other God forbid half Jew. He said his grandmother was in Auschwitz, and he basically was saying the Jewish people are evil and they do these satanic rituals and we worship Satan, and it's just again and again and again. So from that respect, I have a lot of arguments with God forbid I'll call low level people who question on the JQ, not your Kevin McDonald's or Bjerknes, but people who know very little about history or very little about the Jewish religion. So in that respect, like Bjerknes was actually a fresh of breath air that he's probably read just as many books as I have.
I had on my program, I had a similar experience in that I've interviewed people who are anti-Jewish, I would say, and a lot of them are legitimate scholars, like E. Michael Jones, who I think is a very eminent and legitimate scholar, even though I vehemently disagree with several issues that he brings up, and we've talked about that, and he's a regular, so I admire that. And I don't know about McDonald, but I think he's a serious scholar. I had on my program the Richard Spencer, and we weren't there to talk.
I saw that. It was over a year ago. That's the first time I saw your show.
We weren't there to talk about Judaism. We were talking about white nationalism and white supremacy. And in the course of the conversation, I mentioned that I'm Jewish because it related to something that he said. And the audience went berserk. I mean, I had the most vile and the most despicable and hateful comments coming in at me, personal comments, what I look like, really nasty stuff. Most of which I left on, much of it which I deleted because it's not appropriate for family viewing. But I think that might be some of what you're coming up with. And I think that is, unfortunately, a part of Adam Green's audience and certainly Bjerknes' audience. With Bjerknes, sure, he can quote chapter and verse. It's like how the left works, actually. If you ever argue with a Marxist, they will have every quote which was said on this day, and this is the quote, and here it is. And it's all very factual. But if you take a look at the broader context of what they're doing and what their motivations are, that's really where it lies. I mean, it's sort of like, it becomes an exercise in dishonesty. And I think with Bjerknes, I noticed that in his attack on you, his emphasis, he always went back to talking about the Jewish version of the end times, right? In the end times, the Jewish people are going to conquer the world and all this kind of crap. Whether or not there are Talmudic sentences that could be interpreted that way, putting it aside, I mean, the end times is something that's up to the Lord our God, King of the universe. We're not going to bring about the end times. And, you could take a look at the Christian version of the end times in the book of Revelations. It's not exactly, warm and fuzzy, in terms of what's going to happen to different groups of people. And of course, we won't even mention the Islamic version of end times. The point I'm making here is that it's really unfair for him to base much of his argument on quoting what's going to happen in the end times according to the Talmud, because that is something that will take care of itself. That's not something we're talking about with regard to what the Jewish people relate to right now, today, or even historically. So that's one criticism I have of him.
Before you get to the second one, I would say quickly, I think it is fair in a sense that that's what they brought me there for. People want to know the answers to what do Jews really believe, and they found someone who has a basic understanding that Jews have a negative effect on European peoples, and having Jewish people in European society has a largely negative effect on so-called host society. And the audience wanted someone to press people on these issues. What do you people actually believe? Why are you doing what you're doing? And that's why I say Adam Green, who focuses on, in my extent, like I almost praised him that he's focusing on subjects the mainstream news won't cover, like the Rebbe, Jared Kushner, our actual religion. Is saying, like, almost no Orthodox Jew has ever platformed, and even God forbid, Rabbi Goldstein, who made some mainstream news appearances, he was just basically able to say a brief thing about what happened to him and how he's going to push on. And then when he actually tried to describe his belief system, they cut him off and said, like, well, that's not interesting for our news channel. At best, he was able to push his vision that the Rebbe had said we need to re-talk about having a moment of silence. But so from my perspective, someone like Adam Green is the only one who's actually talking about this stuff. And just like most Jews are skeptical, saying most Jews are secular. I'm a Baal Tshuva. The majority of my family and associates I grew up with are very skeptical of the truth of our religion or Orthodoxy or Chabad Lubavitch. So from some respect, there's not really an argument that Bjerknes or Green said that I haven't heard from my fellow Jews that are skeptical of, should they become a Baal Tshuva or not, or even from my, liberal younger Jews that are, saying, should they be Zionist or not? Should they support Israel or not? And also I see the kind of civil war brewing, because I pray in modern Orthodox schools. I know a lot of Orthodox people, and then they get to university and it's BDS, and they're they've kind of lived in isolated society of only being around their fellow Orthodox Jews, and then they get to university and they want to do everything possible to prevent BDS. And they've never met a Palestinian. They've really never had any non-Jewish friends. And even the Pew survey will show that a lot of Orthodox Jews will go through their whole life without having any non-Jewish friends. And then you get to like AIPAC and lobbying and trying to push society. I don't understand. I'm sure if you go to synagogue, like, why do they hate us? Why do they hate us? Type thing. When a person lives in the bubble, me as a half Jew, me as a Baal Tshuva, I've dealt with this, God forbid, even from my own family members, my own friends that I grew up with, and certainly all the time with my own fellow Jews that are just like, why are you doing this nonsense? No one believes in this.
Well, I mean, I think even religious Christians have to deal with that too, amongst Christians. But just to, and I want to talk about the actual faith, because we need to get into addressing some of the issues brought up there. But I think I should mention beforehand that in full disclosure, I'm nothing to hide, but I had Bjerknes on my show, and he didn't last long. It didn't go well. And I became emotional after he made reference to the Jewish people having a bad character.
Worse than Rabbi Weiss? Were you more upset from Bjerknes or Rabbi Weiss?
I have him on long enough to be that upset. with Weiss, we were like shrieking like banshees by the end of the show, the both of us. But with Bajorkness, I took issue with that emotionally, that he would say that such a thing, that we're bad characters, that there's something about Judaism that causes that. And he became incensed and he stormed off the show. So that ended it.
Well, in some respect, isn't that what Nietzsche and Kant said? The character of the Jew to not be able to be honest in a straightforward manner. So I mean, he's really just repeating the arguments of Kant and Nietzsche.
And I get emotional if I had them on the show too. I mean, it's wrong.
Just like Richard Spencer, he's the Nietzsche, kind of like a amateur Nietzsche professor, but your average American's not that scholarly and hasn't read that literature. So when you get to the person who starts reading Kant or Nietzsche, and they say, is the question of the Jewish person possibly dishonest? Do we have a dual morality system? That's why I pushed back and said, okay, you might quote, obviously we have a belief system and we believe that we're going to be rewarded for following our religion, but unquestionably honesty, not cheating, not lying, not stealing, these are straightforward. Today, they are incumbent upon all Jews to be honest. You can't cheat a non-Jew, despite what we may believe, how we're going to, how the end of times is going to play out. And then he kept on picking on like things where he would say are a sign of possible dishonesty, like usury or something like that. And where I was pushing back, even if we do have a system where like me and you can't charge each other interest, but we could charge a non-Jew interest, and it's okay, if you think that's wrong, that's still not dishonesty, because we're relatively transparent about that. Everyone knows that that's part of the Jewish belief system.
I want to ask you about that, but first of all, I want to point out that I would suggest that we have a higher level of morality and honesty. There's only one condition in Judaism where you're allowed to lie, and that is, it's called pekuach nefesh. It means that if your life or someone in your immediate vicinity's life is at danger, unless you lie, unless you tell something, it's to say, the literal translation of that is to save a life. Like if you're approached in the Holocaust by a Nazi stormtroopers and they ask you if you're a Jew, you can say no because it saves your life. That's the only time that it is permitted in Jewish law to lie for a Jew. Whether it be to other Jews or non-Jews is not relevant. Now, you talk about Adam Green is very focused on this issue of the Noahide laws and how he claims that the Chabad movement is trying to implement this all over the world as a means, sort of as a disguise to cause a world government controlled by the Jews. Now, I think that he's complete. I've never heard an interpretation of the Noahide laws like the one he presents. That is not what I understand the Noahide laws are at all. First of all, they're voluntary. No one is forced to follow the Noahide laws. I think the Chabad movement wants nations to endorse them, but that doesn't, they're not laws that have anything to do with benefiting the Jews. They actually are just a couple of simple moral precepts. Thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not steal, that are universal. It has nothing to do with Judaism. It doesn't benefit Jews in any way. And it has nothing to do with any kind of a government. And the other thing, and this is something you and I probably disagree about, but Green says that one of the Noahide laws is that you should not engage in idol worship. He claims that Judaism views Christianity as a form of idol worship, which means that we're trying to ban Christianity. I don't think so. I don't think that we view Christians as idol worshipers.
Yeah, we debated, and I actually pressed him on that to say that it's basically a parallel to the second commandment, and we believe in a prohibition of idol worship. But certainly there's debate among sages in current Israel, and he was able to show me countless rabbis that do believe like that. So, and I was able to say that wasn't how the Rebbe felt. However, there was a controversy with Rabbi Pinson, who met the Pope, a year ago, and he was, defrocked, so to say, because the Rebbe held us forbidden to meet the Pope. And it might be a fair question, so to say, that in common parlance, in modern America, my beliefs are my beliefs, or we have freedom. But if someone really wants to pin down, like we had in our previous discussions, what is our true view of Christianity? What does the Talmud actually say? That even if me and you could say that's not how we feel, what about the sizable chunk of the Jewish community that openly says otherwise, especially now that Israel has risen to be more power, and you have more extreme elements within Israel that are more willing to say a hardline opinion. So if a guy like Bjerknes is saying, I've read your Talmud, I've read your book going back thousands of years, and I think that's what you guys really believe. And now you see in Israel where he quoted the chief Sephardi rabbi who was talking about, Goyim are here to serve us. And, say he was more scholarly, that he was able to hit me with countless quotes from these actual Jewish sources and rabbis that are in disagreement. So it was almost like Talmud class where he's like, okay, that's what you say, Charles, but here's 100 rabbis that say the opposite.
It's hard of it in the middle of a debate to respond when stuff like that's thrown up at you. He said the same thing on my show. The Sephardic rabbi said that non-Jews are to be servants of the Jews. And I looked into that, and that's not what he said. It was it's completely out of context, classic of this sort of way to do things. I mean, he was talking about a very specific group of people at a very specific situation with regard to, I think it was Palestinian terrorists what do you do about them? And he was wrong, and he was rebuked for that, but it wasn't exactly the way Bjerknes decided to spin that, that all people are going to be enslaved and all non-Jews. Now, as far as claiming their Christianity as idol worship, I mean, maybe there's some extreme Jews who are saying this now because things have become more polarized. I don't think that's ever been mainstream Judaism. I don't think that's what the Talmud says when they talk about paganism. That's not, that is something that has to do with, it's not just the worship of graven images, which Christians don't do. Catholics don't do that. They may have images that aid them in prayer, but they're not praying to those images like they're gods. And I don't think that most Jews have ever believed that. But I think that, it's not just the worship of a graven image, but it's all the practices that surrounded that worship. Throwing the infant in the belly of Moloch, sexual orgies. I mean, whatever else they were doing. That it was a very corrupt system that the Torah rails against. It's not Christianity, and I don't think. I mean, it was actually Rashi, who I understand was asked this question, and he pondered over it for many, many years. And toward the end of his life, he came out with a statement or document saying that Christianity is not idol worship. So for him to isolate a couple of out of context statements by rabbis who generally have been rebuked by the vast majority of Jews and claim that this is proof, that's a classic tactic that actually is very typical, as I say, on the left. I've debated Marxists and leftists for years, and this is exactly how they roll also. And
is it fair play? I mean, isn't that basically what people worry about Islam, coming to the West, and we say, well, what about it says in all these texts and these different verses? And I say, like, okay, yeah, I mean, he could have, say, did he actually read a whole bunch of things, and he's purposely picking and choosing the most egregious things to, try to, with nefarious motivations? Or is it somewhat fair play where he's saying, I want to know the truth of what you guys actually believe, and it's fair game to ask you about what these different rabbis hold. And a lot of people I have, like the alt-right, so to say, debaters will, largely kind of renounce liberal Jews or pro-immigration, like, well, I don't like the ADL, like I don't like all these people protesting ICE and immigration. But then you say, well, isn't that the majority of American Jews? Like, aren't you being hit on social media with the 36 Jews who got arrested trying to shut down ICE, or, the Jewish papers saying that we successfully shut down ICE in Washington, D.C. or something like that? And, so if you're looking at the text, and I was thinking from an internal perspective, Jews are not friendly to Jews becoming Christian. That certainly is true, God forbid, in the Crusades. We know that a lot of people, sacrifice their own children. I mean, there's debates of the truthness rather than have them possibly be baptized and convert to Christianity. All the debates about even the church who had saved Jewish children and from the Holocaust and had them baptized. Do the Jews have a right to take them back and prevent them from being Christian? And even from your own circles, if you're in modern Orthodox or Orthodox, what percentage of your fellow Jews would disown their own child if they converted to Christianity versus saying, what do we want to impose on the non-Jews? So saying like as a Jew, we're not the same religion as Christianity, and we have strenuous efforts to try to prevent Jews from becoming Christian. Even in Israel, the brother Nathaniel case or brother Daniel case or whatever, that the Supreme Court ruled that he couldn't become an Israeli citizen because he converted to Christianity, to an extrapolation that I mean, the unfortunate reality, which is hard to say, is Christianity is a good religion for a non-Jew. And
Yes.
say me and you agreed on that. We say Christianity is a bad religion for a Jew, but it's a good religion for a non-Jew. And if you could somewhat accept that, and if that would be somewhat like kosher for a non-Jew to say, oh, that makes sense. Christianity is a good religion for non-Jews and a bad religion for Jews, versus from them drawing on that to say, well, if you don't let your own kids become Christian and you would disown your own kids or even prefer they died, then become Christian, am I really supposed to believe? So to me, I thought it was fair game to debate that, in the sense, obviously, historically, that's led to expulsions and pogroms. And, what about Islam? Don't you constantly say those things about Islam? And would you be cherry picking? I mean, just for the sake of argument, when you call out all these things about Islam and their text, and then when you say when it's done to you, that's a different story.
Well, I mean, one thing is we're comparing apples and oranges here. Islam does call for world conquest openly, and they engage in it. That's what 9/11 was all about. It wasn't Jews or Christians flying those planes. I mean, Islam, the whole concept of jihad is a concept of physically, literally conquering the world. And I would compare Islam more to communism than to Christianity or Judaism in that sense. There are different ideologies, and and some of them are under the guise of religion, some aren't. But they're differences, and they can be identified. It's all fair game. It is fair game to talk about whether or not Judaism is supremacist, as Adam Green would say. I would argue that, and as long as people are willing to come on and debate those issues, fine. I would argue it's not. Now, as far as separating Jews and Christians, and that it's a terrible thing for a Jew to convert and leave Judaism and become another religion, and in this case, it would be Christian, because that's where the 99% of Jews have lived all these many millennia. Then, to me, that's fine. It's not a slam at Christianity. It's simply any more than that the Catholic Church up until recently made it a model sin for a Roman Catholic's foot to cross the threshold of a Protestant church. They would be in sin. They would be damned. Or if you leave Catholicism or Christianity, you're going to go to hell. And hell is a hot and shitty place in Christian literature, I may add. These are just parts of religions generally. The idea that your belief system needs to be preserved in its own right, and that it's kind of almost a social construct that you don't want people to stray out of it, and that there are penalties if they do. So I don't think that that's certainly unique to Judaism, nor do I think that means that Judaism views itself as superior to anyone else. It doesn't. But they did bring up one other thing here, speaking of supremacy. Both Adam Green and Bajorkness brought up the idea that the Talmud says that the Jewish soul is superior to the non-Jewish soul. And on that point, they're absolutely right. That is what the Talmud says.
I looked into it. It appears Maimonides is the only major sage who doesn't agree with that Maimonides said the essential nature of the soul is the same between the Jew and non-Jew, and it's philosophical, intellectual endeavors that bring a person close to God, and a non-Jew could do that also. But that was the only major sage that I could find that didn't hold that there was a fundamental difference between the Jewish and non-Jewish soul, and especially the Kabbalists had these, all the statements of Chabad and the Arizal about, God forbid, coming from impurities or there's statements in the Talmud all over the place that, so you have to reconcile, that do we disagree with our ancestors? You're going to say, okay, I follow Maimonides on this one, or you're going to openly say, like the Rebbe had actually, when he republished the Tanya, was asked about that. You could see the letter where the Rebbe said, yes, he agrees that, God forbid, the source of the non-Jewish souls is impurity, and he based that off of, so to say, his opinion, their unwillingness to do anything to save Jews during the war. So, do you fundamentally defend that and try to be an apologist and say, yes, that is part of our religion, or do you just embrace it and say, yes, the world will be redeemed through us? We do believe in God, and we do. That's why we follow a religion, because we believe that. And how would you have approached that?
Well, my understanding, and I've looked at some responsa on this from rabbis, and I've did a little bit of research. I'm not a scholar in this area, but my understanding is that the idea is that the Jewish soul only becomes bigger when the Jew observes the Torah, when the Jew observes the moral and ethical precepts of the Torah. Then they have the opportunity of enlarging their soul beyond the non-Jew, because the Jew is given an extra layer of responsibility in this world to be a priestly sect and to minister to the rest of the world on these issues by embracing them. But in a sense, I saw a rabbi make an interesting comparison. He said you could look at it as like a car with a 10-gallon tank and a car with a 5-gallon tank. The Jewish car might have the capacity to take 10 gallons of gas, whereas the Christian car can only take 5. But the Christian car could be filled with 5 gallons, whereas the Jewish soul would only have 1 gallon. So it has a lot to do with the content of what you put in that soul that makes and that the Jew does have the opportunity to enlarge because they're observant, because they believe they're God-fearing. And if you take a look at the Talmud and the Torah throughout, it makes reference to God-fearing people. That's a reference to non-Jews who believe in God. They are absolutely capable of achieving a full spiritual level in Jewish understanding in every generation. So I think you need to put this idea into context. It's not a supremacist idea. If you put it in the hands of a Bajorkness or one of these people who really don't understand Judaism, I doubt if that man knows any Jews. I doubt if he's ever stepped foot in a synagogue. Has he ever studied with a Talmudic rabbi? Or is he busy reading, Douglas Reed's Mysteries of Zion? You would understand the religious and spiritual understanding of these things, not just taking a look at the literal fundamental words and then, in a sense, filling them up with your own beliefs in a way.
Yeah, I hit him on that. It was like, is he the rabbi? He's the one explaining Jewish theology. Is he here to ask me questions?
Hebrew? Has he studied the Torah in its real meaning? I mean, the Christian King James Bible, by the way, I mean,
but is that his fault? Is that the fault of the larger Jewish community and the path of fighting anti-Semitism as opposed to having conversation, or even your attitude where you say, okay, he's a malevolent actor, as opposed to maybe a more Chabad attitude where lightness expels darkness, and for whatever reason, his personal experience or karma, so to say, has put him on the opposite side of this issue, that through discourse and proper conversation, through Derek Black, the Don Black's son, who was invited by his Jewish college. I heard that guy was actually a convert who did it, but invited him to a Shabbos meal, and eventually he renounced his father's path. But that was through the kindness of a Jew who said, "I'm gonna, let me show you what Judaism's really about. Come to my Shabbos meal." And type attitude, as opposed to saying this guy's a malevolent actor. And then you have organizations where, unfortunately, if you would agree that a large portion of Israeli politics or American Jewish organizations would be ban them, censor them, ruin their lives. And I even, Jonathan Greenblatt, he came to Michigan and did a town hall at the local JCC, and I asked him about, so to say, dealing with trolls, and he said, I never talk to trolls. I recommend reporting them, blocking them.
I totally reject that. The whole ADL thing is wrong, and it's not the way to go. And maybe I should.
But you still support AIPAC. I mean, do you still support AIPAC?
No, I don't. I don't support that action of them. And let me just amend a little bit my comments about Bajorkness. Maybe, by virtue of the fact that he was willing to go on. I mean, I'm angry because he dropped out of my show, and he then when I approached him again, he said, if I ever contact him again, he's going to report me to the authorities. I don't know who the hell he's talking about, but
I don't even know if he's in Europe or America. I mean, Bajorkness.
So maybe that's fueling my thoughts on him. But maybe I might amend it slightly and say that at least he was willing to appear with you on the internet and answer questions and talk about that. So maybe that's a redeeming value. Maybe there's some hope that, if someone wants to embrace the views that he embraces, that's fine. But all I ask is that they are willing to come up and debate them and discuss them in a reasonable and fair atmosphere. Maybe I was wrong to get emotional with him, and I should have, looking back, I might have handled it a little differently. But I was triggered, as the old saying goes.
But if comes to Adam Green, I mentioned it offline. I did mention that I've been talking with you, and he actually watched the video that me and you did on Shabbatai Tzvi and the false Messiah, and he said Dr. Brown had invited him to speak, and I agreed with them that it's likely that the conversation, or certainly with Dr. Brown, that the conversation would go awry, and then Dr. Brown would just say, "This man's an anti-Semite."
Dr. Brown cut his throat. I wouldn't go on with Dr. Brown. I would.
Was it a lose-lose with you? Saying if Adam Green were to speak with you,
Michael Jones. I mean, he's a change agent. I view him as somewhat of a left-wing, actor and agent. I don't know his background, but yeah, I would advise Adam not to go on with him. He's not doing him any favors. He's going to smear him and attack him personally, and that's what he did to E. Michael Jones is really bad. It's really wrong.
What's the end game where you say? I mean, it's unclear the rising anti-Semitism, whether in some ways I think anti-Semitism in America is at all-time lows, even though it's increasing. But the amount of people that are becoming skeptical about the role of Jews in society, and obviously, like the strong push against immigration reform by the larger Jewish community that you may be in disagreement about, but you have to admit that.
You and I have talked about the origins of that. We don't agree on that. I think it's a Sabbatean Frankist influence.
But what does it matter if the larger Jewish community is just going to keep on pushing these things regardless about?
They're up to it. I mean, I agree with people like Adam Green about that. I mean, there are too many Jews who are on the far left and they're pushing a leftist agenda. The only thing I would add to this is that they are betraying their faith. They're not involved in belief in God, most of them. They don't understand the moral and ethical precepts of the Torah. They may think they do, some of them, but they are in error in terms of...
the flip side, the push to recognize Iran as a bad actor, where you could say from Israel's perspective, certainly Iran is a threat, but from America's perspective, how much of a threat is Iran actually, and is the Jewish lobby, so to say, doing American Jews any favor by trying to make it look like Iran is actually existential threat to America, and when you have people like Netanyahu.
I agree with you on that. I disagree with Israel. We should not bring the United States into a war against Iran. I mean, I actually argued this point with recently with Israeli politician David Rubin.
Yeah, I watched that.
Yeah, he's sort of advocating that the United States there's immediate urgency. They're about to build a nuclear bomb. We have to, and I would say to that, no, it's a mistake.
That was the Leslie Stahl clip. I assume Adam Green. Like I saw it through Adam Green because I don't follow Leslie Stahl, but she spoke to the Israeli general, and she's like, basically they want the U.S. to fight Iran for Israel, and she said it in a certain way, like that made it kind of look like subversive, like she had been fooled by the Israelis into trying to explain their opinion, that they think if they have problems with Iran, they're going to lose. So what they need is America to do it for them. And if that's the perspective, even to say, how do we go about, Netanyahu is an extremely loud voice. When you were a kid, you didn't have a guy like Netanyahu on all the major TV stations. And, Israel now is a very fast global power, a military power. If I don't know if it's true, like, how many assassinations and covert operations we're carrying out. And, certainly Israel's a huge weapons dealer. And, that's why I said the brewing civil war with the conflicting interests between American Jews and Israeli Jews, or possibly European people who are not on board, like Putin in his interview on the Financial Times, if you saw it, was saying Western liberalism is kind of dead. Was funny, Trump in that interview where they asked him about is Western liberalism dead, and he answered about far left movements in California. But Putin was saying yes, like multiculturalism, immigration, these ideas have failed Europe. And so that sentiment that is becoming very popular, what are we as the Jewish community going to do about it? And is it natural to say, yes, anti-Semitism is likely to increase, and it's unlikely that me and you are going to be able to put our heads together and stop the rising tide of people questioning the role that Jews are playing in society. And so that's why me and you became friendly, because we're from the very few people on the web that are having these conversations with the people who are asking the toughest questions. And unfortunately, I don't have power. Jonathan Greenblatt, I asked a question, and even my local Jews, like, I've never got a slap on the back at my local synagogue for doing any of this. In fact, relatively, this has only caused me to lose standing in the Jewish community, coming out and attempting to speak to these people. And
I mean, there are people that, like, at my synagogue who just despise me for being outspoken, and I think that the ADL is working with our YouTube and Facebook to try to ban any reference that they even think is remotely anti-Semitic, as they define the term, and that's wrong. I mean, I'm absolutely against that, and I think that also E. Michael Jones is absolutely right when he points out that the term anti-Semitism applies to anybody that disagrees with liberal Judaism.
You seem to have success in getting mainstream Jewish people on your podcast, and like, I actually bought that book on from Professor Sarnow that he mentioned on your show about when Grant expelled the Jews. So I watched that and ordered that book. I actually ordered that book on Hollywood Traders. That person came from your show. So you seem to have had success on getting, even though you're doing things that generally most of these people that appeared on your show would not do. They probably would not have had conversations with the people you had, but yet you still have.
Well, I should mention in disclosure that some of those interviews I'm posting are from my archive, and I did them several years ago. I honestly don't think they'd come on with me now. I think the atmosphere has changed. I used to have Noam Chomsky on with me regularly. He wouldn't come on with me now. He won't speak to me anymore. It's not because of me personally. It's because the left doesn't talk to the right. People don't. There's no longer a debate. The divide has become very, very profound. So it's difficult to get those kinds of interviews. But look, I mean, I think that Michael Jones's critique is correct as far as it goes, in that there are a lot of leftists, a lot of Jews have been on the vanguard of left-wing movements, even going back to the Bolsheviks. I would point out that as far as Israel and involvement in trying to push the Iraq War, the neocons, they're not, there are plenty of Protestant neocons as well. There are even several Catholic neocons. It's bigger than just Israel. Yes, Israel plays a role in it. Sure, the Israelis wanted the United States to get rid of Saddam Hussein, which they were wrong to do. It was a mistake. And now they may very well be advocating war against Iran. But to just focus on that one aspect, it's a much bigger problem. It's this globalist agenda that's allied with the left, and that's It goes back. I mean, I've done studies on this. On the Catholic side, it's the Illuminati. On the Protestant side, it's the Rhodes Roundtable groups that get spawned the Council on Foreign Relations and the Royal Institute of International Affairs, both of those of which wouldn't even let Jews get in until the 1950s. So, we can take a look at a broader issue of what it is, this globalist neocon agenda, or just globalist. I mean, neocon is only a piece of it, that is pushing perpetual war as a way to create a world order. It's not, to isolate that just to looking at Israel and the Jews. It almost is a way to not address this bigger issue by focusing on that. Israel's establishment, yes, they're probably a part of that to a large extent, as are most of the European capitals, as is the United States. It's one of the reasons they hate Trump. He actually wasn't supposed to be elected. I mean, he's comes in as this kind of establishment figure in the real sense, and that these people are powerful players. We have to oppose them because of who they are and what they believe in. It's not a Jewish issue. The Judaism is a piece of it, or at least the Jewish establishment is. And then we have to look at the nature of that, of what sort of Judaism they believe in. People like Bajorkness, and even to an extent Michael Jones, they believe that Judaism itself is responsible for this. That because we rejected Jesus, because we crucified Jesus, which by the way, I debate, but putting it aside, because of that, we're involved in perpetual revolution and we are subversives. That to me is not provable. That history doesn't show that. Judaism, if you understand it, doesn't show that at all. It's actually a very conservative faith. Anyway, but we need to take a look at and broaden the lens and look at the overall conspiracy, of which Judaism, left-wing Judaism, is only a piece of it.
Yeah, I have these debates constantly, and largely it comes back to immigration, because I think if you are anti-immigration, even a person so say they're not racist, they just are anti-immigration, you are going to see that your biggest opponents on the opposite side in City Hall are largely Jewish organizations. I mean, we're not the only ones that are fighting Trump and his immigration measures, but certainly we're on the forefront of it, and a person who is trying to fight for certain policies, especially in white nationalist perspective, they're going to see that their opponents are Jewish organizations, and to me the JQ is a fair question, so to say, from any level of group, what is a person's effect on greater society is actually a good question, and that's a question that we should collectively look in the mirror and ask ourselves constantly. And I think the Lubavitch Rebbe, despite the quotes I was saying, that the Lubavitch Rebbe was famous for world peace, charity, and always made statements. There's the Rebbe lived under a camera, and all his letters have basically been released, and he's constantly telling people to benefit the people around them. And Rabbi Goldstein, his speech in the UN, he didn't mention any of the stuff they were talking about. He mentioned charity and love and universal brotherhood and in these certain elements. And to me, that's probably why Chabad has risen to be such a large power, and also because I know we train Chabad rabbis here in Metro Detroit, and obviously if you have a young rabbi who's going to dedicate their life to opening up a synagogue, going to a new place, they're going to deal with this all the time. And I met an Iranian descendant of the Prophet in Chabad, when I was in Stony Brook University, and the guy, taught me a lot in terms of knowing about this stuff. But he was hanging out at Chabad, and the rabbi was like kind of skeptical, and he's like, okay, guy's not Jewish, he's Muslim, but he still let the guy hang out there.
Yeah, and that's how Chabad rolls. I mean, they let everybody come in. It's an incredible organization. I don't understand this attack on Chabad. By the way, I don't think that Jared Kushner is a Chabadnik. I mean, they're friendly with Chabad, but Adam Green has this whole conspiracy theory around that.
Well, that's why I say he's Chabad in the sense that he prays in a Chabad synagogue. He lets the Chabad rabbi determine what's kosher or not. I think the conversion of Ivanka Trump eventually got turned over to Yeshiva University. I mean, he's not getting his advice on politics, and presumably, your average, if you follow what Chabad says, they usually preach a more universal message of harmony between the Jewish people and the Jews as a light to nations, that we should actively be focusing on benefiting the societies we're part of. And that's why Chabad keeps on growing and growing.
Yeah.
And even Chabad might be big tent now. It's difficult for Chabad to incorporate, like, if not now, in these Jews for justice and anti-immigration protests, but even they will do the best of their ability to be big tent and to include the anti-Israel sentiment. Here in Metro Detroit, the vast liberal movements that started even protesting Chabad based on what they would call support of the occupation or different things, where became increasingly difficult even for Chabad to be big tent to the larger extreme leftist Jewish community that's growing and growing, and especially the younger Jews. And the divide, I don't know if you sent your children to a Jewish private school, but the divide between the Jews who grow up within Jewish institutions versus the Jewish community that grow up separate from Jewish institutions. And you're just from a kind of deterministic perspective of environment, that if someone grew up on the outside of Jewish institutions, they would probably also be very skeptical of Israel. And then when you get to universities and the people who went to Jewish private schools and they know Hillel and all these organizations, and they're saying we have to stop BDS, and almost every university has regular votes on BDS, versus the person who grew up outside of Jewish organizations, and most of their friends are non-Jews, and then they have Palestinian friends, and it's very difficult for them to fit into the internal circles of people who've always been part of Jewish institutions. And that's why I'm calling the brewing civil war among American Jewry.
No, I see the same trend. I think it's also happening in the state of Israel. And
I'm an anomaly. People like me who became Baal Tshuva, God forbid, that's why I'm an alter Bocher, because I'm an anomaly here in Metro Detroit. There's of 70 plus thousand Jews in Metro Detroit, or whatever my age group. There's at most tens of people like me.
And I've experienced something very similar in Boston, even though, I've just, and by the way, some of the people that oppose me are actually more ostensibly religious than I am, at least I'll admit, at least in appearance. But it's a troubling phenomena. As far as the state of Israel goes, I think that Israel has its own agenda. Israel does what Israel thinks they need to do to survive. They're facing a genocidal threat. And that sometimes does mean dragging countries like even the United States into their affairs. And we need to answer the more fundamental question, which is, why does Israel have to face that kind of threat? Why are there still nations and groups of people that want to wipe Israel out? And why do they? That's the issue, not whether or not Israel's defending itself. They're going to defend themselves in any way they can, like any sane sovereign nation does. If you live in a tough neighborhood, you put bigger locks on your door. You might get a gun.
Well, BDS is largely caused by the growing number of the Palestinian population, like Rashida Tlaib. Metro Detroit has well over 10,000 Palestinians, and almost all BDS measures are introduced by Palestinian students. And almost every major university these days has a sizable number of Palestinian students. And you think, okay, I know hundreds of Palestinians. I have my YouTube page. I go to these Palestinian events. I try to speak with them. But your average person who grew up within Jewish institutions, they've never met a Palestinian. And then when they get to university, it's almost an immediate hostility. Oh my God, here's these Palestinian organizations. We have to stop them. And versus your liberal Jews who are saying I'm friends with these Palestinians. I care about their suffering, and it breaks my heart to think that it's possibly our people that are causing their suffering. And you couple that with historic anti-Semitism or white nationalism and left-right dynamics, or even if the God forbid the history between Christians or Europeans and Jews, that the Europeans are generally trained to know to not speak about these things, as opposed to people coming from other country and immigrants that are pretty widely open. Because generally the most common remarks I get from crazy questions on Judaism comes from like, African Americans, and it even comes from African immigrants.
And they don't really understand the issue. They're exposed to.
Because they never would have been told, just say like it's not, it's rude to ask that question. That only someone who's been grown up in the politically correct society, and outside of the West, I think political correctness is basically non-existent.
No, yeah, I mean, and as far as those who are exposed to politically correct views, they don't really understand the issue, and sometimes when they're exposed to it in a broader sense, it's beneficial. I've had that kind of conversation. And as far as BDS goes, while I vigorously oppose it, I don't think it's right to ban it. People have a right to boycott whatever the hell they want to boycott,
I watched that Amherst. They just released it where I think the Vijay Prasad, if that's near you, the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where they had that big convention. But I mean, our perspectives are largely the same. That and I'm a speed reader. I find certainly in my chat you see the rise, and I'd noticed this when I was a student in university. People largely from China and India that looked at Hitler in a good light due to possible international politics, where they looking okay that maybe they're not anti-Semitic, but they understand, God forbid, why a person might not want minorities in their society, or from a global perspective that maybe the Germans recognize the free and independent India or something like that. To now in my chat, like I get people who God forbid are praising that and re-examining, and that's why I think it's extremely important to answer these questions. I mean, I think both of us like Henry Abramson from Touro College, and I like the work that he does, but he always says no difficult questions, please. So who's going to answer the difficult questions? And like there's not many people out there. I appreciate the work you're doing.
You and I are trying to do it, and in fact, I'm going to suggest that maybe we do a couple of three-way conversations. Let me just
I'll forward this to.
Let's see if we can get Adam Green, and we'll put him up on my station with you and I, and maybe some of these other people that you've mentioned. We could have some great debates, and it would be very, very interesting, I think, and very much in line with the work.
I think really the debate's going to be with Christopher, because Adam Green's younger and doesn't have as much information. He's already a successful streamer.
If you could book that one,
I'll forward this when you post it. I'll message it.
I don't think he'll come on with me, but
then are you actually going to go through his literature and saying like the Einstein debate? I showed him Stephen Gilbert, and I enjoyed that book, Einstein and the Jewish Science. And even when I was in University of Michigan, I didn't finish the class, but I sat in the first day for like upper level physics course, and the teacher was from Germany, and he was talking about space-time, and he openly on the first day started talking about how he thought Einstein was overrated, and he doesn't understand why Einstein is given all the credit for these theories. And that's also an interesting topic, but it's a question of time. Jerkness wrote a 3,000-page book on Einstein.
Yeah, I don't know if we can do that, but yet we could talk with someone who has done that research and just try to see about a reasonable discussion.
Who is there, though? I mean, the unfortunate reality, like World War II revisionism is increasing. I had Veronica Kuzniar, who was a student of David Irving, and she knew a lot, saying like she knew way more than me. She could list, hundreds and hundreds of names from memory and orders. And
we'll do some prep work, but let's bring them on. If you can book them, then let's do it.
Yeah, that's what we're doing. So that's why, I knew you were busy the last few weeks, and we were supposed to stream.
It's sort of a mission of mine and yours. So, anyways, Doovid, I kind of have to wrap it up now. So, let listeners know where they can reach you and how they can get more information.
Okay, well, I'm just on Doovid. Unfortunately, due to a lot of trolling, I'm David Kelton. We're on Facebook, but generally I just go by Doovid on YouTube because unfortunately I get a lot of negative pushback, and I have all different types of things I'm promoting. I'm trying to have more of these conversations, but I use my YouTube page for basically all different type things, and sometimes I just record things for different organizations and put it up on my YouTube. But I will be continuing having these conversations. I enjoy it. This is what I research in my spare time. And I will, once you post this, besides I'll share it on my social media, I'll also privately message it to Adam Green and Christopher and tell Adam that you'd like to speak with him. And Christopher, I'm going to actually try to read his book, and I thought I'd invite him on my channel, but I'll tell him that you thought it was unfortunate how that talk that you two had, and that you wouldn't mind trying the conversation again.
Thank you. And also some of the other people you mentioned as well. We could get a couple of the BDS types up, all of it. Anyways, David, thanks so much for joining me, and talk to you soon.
Have a great day.
Thank you.